Well, if you don't get involved in politics in your HOA or condominium association, hold on to your wallet and watch
Yeah.
out for your bank account, because whoever gets in control of that board and of the money and the purse strings, they're going to be the ones making the decisions about how much money to spend.
Had enough of excessive fines, selective enforcement, and nosy Karens? Welcome to the Association Nightmares podcast. If you're tired of being pushed around by your HOA or condo association, you've come to the right place. Property owners, get ready to take back your power. And now, here are your hosts, Ann and Mark.
So welcome back. Today in our episode of Association Nightmares, we are joined by homeowner rights advocate, the rebel with behind a screen, the rebel with a typewriter, Deborah Goonan. Deborah is the author for the past nearly 10 years of the Independent American Communities blog. She is an advocate for homeowner rights. And how was it that we happened to find Deborah in the first place?
Well, I found her blog and I signed up for the blog, the newsletters, and I started to read it. And I sent you some of her articles, and we were both blown away by the depth of research that she does. She's amazing what she finds out, and the way she puts the information together is just mind blowing. So I was lucky to come across her, and I consider her a very good friend at this point. She's wonderful, and I recommend everybody sign up for her blog.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk with Deborah about the transparency within the association community industry. Before we dive into today's episode, just a quick update. This episode was recorded before the recent Supreme Court ruling on the Corporate Transparency Act. Since then, the court has lifted the preliminary injunction in the Texas case with an 8-1 decision. However, the ruling does not address the constitutionality of the act itself. It's a procedural step and not the final decision. It's also important to note that a second injunction from a separate case remains active and was not considered by the Supreme Court. As of right now, FinCEN still cannot enforce the requirement for corporations to file beneficial ownership information. This is a fast developing situation, so stay tuned for updates as we learn more about how these cases unfold. Let's bring Deborah on the call and we'll take it from there. Deborah, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, Mark and Ann.
Yes, welcome.
It's our pleasure. So today we're going to be talking about transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And Deborah has done some amazing work on transparency in the HOA industry, specifically as it relates to industry trade group known as CAI. So can you tell us a little bit more, like what is CAI? Because there are a lot of people listening who, they're living in association communities, but they may never have heard of it.
Well, CAI stands for Community Associations Institute. It's a 501c6 organization. They have 47,000 members at the national level, and they have 64 chapters across 39 different states. It's based, the National Association is based in Falls Church, Virginia, and its members are a curious mix of what they call homeowner leaders, which is basically board members of HOAs, and industry professionals. It originally started out in 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And when it started in 1973, it was with a collaboration between the Urban Land Institute, the National Association of Home Builders, the U.S. League of Savings and Loan Associations, Veterans Administration, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and 23 builders. So when the organization began in 1973, it was completely all people who were in the real estate industry that were interested in building and promoting what they call community associations. Another name for them is called common interest communities, where you have some sort of a shared ownership association. And over the years, I want to say probably around the 1990s, CAI started to incorporate some membership of people who were board members, primarily board members in some of their HOAs that were their clients or that they hoped to be their clients at some point. And they kind of did that in in answer to some criticisms that here's a trade group that's claiming to represent homeowners. But if we looked at who were the members, it was primarily people in trade groups.
Yeah, certainly from the inception, it sounds like all trade.
Right,
They
right.
brought in some homeowners, but only on the leadership side. So before we dive way deep into this, Deborah, I mean, you sound like the Encyclopedia Britannica of of the industry. So how did you get there? I mean, this is not your profession, really. How did you become an expert in this field?
Well, I had my own personal experience living in an homeowners association in Florida. Um, we lived there. My husband and I lived there for only maybe 3.5 years. But we had come from, my home state is Pennsylvania. That's where I live now. So when we were coming from Pennsylvania, we didn't really know that much about what a homeowners association is and what it's about. I had a vague sense that yes, there were rules and restrictions, and it's not that we were looking for a home with an HOA per se, but when you go to Florida, especially in the area where we were looking, there really wasn't anything on the market that wasn't in an HOA. I mean, very
Right.
few choices.
Right.
Mhm.
So it was kind of like when we were looking at houses, we were comparing one community to another. And then we settled on one community that seemed to be well maintained. We moved into our house and we had a single family home, but this was a master plan community that had at the time well over 1,000 homes in it. And it included some what they call sub associations of townhouse associations. So it was a mixture of townhomes that were connected side by side and the single family homes that were primarily where in the area where we lived. Not long after we bought our home, we started to see that there was some problems with maintenance and management in the community. For example, we lived next to a retention pond. They called it a Lakeview house, but really people need to know that if you're living in a house that has a view of a pond, it's actually a stormwater management pond. It's not, unless you're living in a lake community that has
A natural.
like a recreational lake with boats and
Right.
things like that. Well, we started to notice that there were huge maintenance problems going on with um, the water level dropping quite a lot, and all the fish that were in the pond died. And then there was this horrible stench, and we had turkey vultures coming and devouring all the dead fish.
Oh,
And
gosh.
we had blue-green algae that was growing all over the surface of the water. And where the shoreline had been exposed, there was erosion going on. Every time it rained, some of it would fall into the pond. And we had waist-high aquatic weeds growing up in the areas that were really nothing more than like a little swamp. And of course, it didn't smell very good either. So very quickly,
Mhm.
our house went from having a lovely view of this pond with a conservation forest behind it to, a kind of an eyesore from outside of our window, and it didn't smell very good either. So I started to talk to some of the other neighbors who bordered this pond, and there was only about a dozen of us. Um, and they were all concerned too. And when we took our concerns to the management office, we got no response. We tried making phone calls, stopping in the office to talk to the manager, and basically we'll look into it, and then nothing happened. So one of my neighbors and I went to a board meeting, And we addressed the board at the end of the meeting. And, you know, a few of the board members came out to our homes to see what we were talking about. And I can still remember that the board president, when she saw what our pond looked like, her chin just dropped. And she admitted it was ugly. But I mean, besides being ugly, we were worried about the environmental impact, you know, because fish were dying and
Mhm.
we had algae and all kinds of other things that aren't really healthy to breathe in or live.
Right.
So the board said that they were going to conduct an investigation and get back to us. Well, that never happened. Long story short, it took 2 years of me and one of my neighbors doing a lot of research of public records and certified letters, return receipt to the board. And we did get the HOA to do some maintenance work, but it required a lot of time and effort on my part, and one of my neighbors helped. The other neighbors didn't really want to get involved. That's another common problem.
Yeah, that was a problem that Anne faced as well in her
Yeah.
fight
Yeah.
against the board. She did have one other neighbor who jumped in with her, but a lot of people just, you know, they don't want to get into the fight and they don't want to stand up for themselves.
Well, and because what happened was when my neighbor and I got involved in this,
Mhm.
and when we started requesting information like financial records, insurance information, we faced a lot of hostility.
Yes.
Yeah, they just decided that we were selfish, disgruntled homeowners because we brought up concerns. And when the hostilities began, my neighbor and I both put our houses up for sale and got out of Dodge. And we considered at the time buying another house. But when I started to look around at other communities, they were all at HOAs.
Mm.
By now, I understood about governing documents, and you know, I went out on the county website and looked at a copy of the CC&Rs and the bylaws and the maps and all of that stuff that you can see in Florida anyway. And what I realized is that the same things that we were having problems with were going to reoccur no matter where I went to one degree or another, because we were dealing with the same kind of restrictions, kind of like boilerplate language that's used over and over again. So we chose to not buy a home, and we rented for a little while and then relocated back up north, where we now own a home that's not in an HOA.
Can I ask you that, you know, since you did that research on governing documents,
Mhm.
did you find that most of them were pretty identical?
There were a lot of repetition, yes, especially if you're dealing with the same builder,
Yes.
you know? So you'll find that a builder might have, you know, a dozen different little developments or how townhouse associations or condominiums or whatever in an area, and they pretty much copy the same thing over and over again.
Right. Yeah, so just for you know, information for the public, it's the developer that files the initial governing documents.
That's
And
correct.
that's what the community is governed by, aside
Right.
from statute. Okay.
Right. And sometimes the statute overrides the governing documents, but more often than not, the governing documents override statute,
Correct. Correct.
because the US law generally views HOAs and condominium associations as a contractual relationship. They see the covenants as a contract, even though you can argue that there's a lot of services that are provided in planned communities and even some condominium associations that are really more like a hyper-local government.
Mm.
Yes.
But
Pseudo government.
right. So my view is that common interest communities are a hybrid of private and public governance,
Mm.
corporate and government.
I think that the term
And
I've
and
heard
where
used
they
often
fit,
as this public-private partnership. You hear that on the internet.
kind of,
Yeah.
but you know,
Yes.
it's kind of on a continuum. I mean,
Mhm.
if you have a small condo association that's 4 units, that's going to be more like a corporation. Whereas if you have a master plan community where they maintain the roads and the street lights and, you know, they offer their own amenities and things like that's going to be more like a mini town, like a mini
Yeah.
town government.
Right.
So,
Hmm.
but how I ended up starting the blog is that when I started to read about all of this stuff and I got involved in some discussion groups on LinkedIn and Facebook, and I realized people were having the same issues, problems even more worse than what we experienced over and over again. And I started to, after lurking on these forums for a while, I started commenting and asking questions. And it occurred to me that there was nothing out on the internet from when I did my research that gave information from a homeowner consumer point of view.
Hmm.
All of the websites that were out there at the time were either run by the industry, you know, a management company or attorneys' offices. You know, they had some blogs and resources. There were very few homeowner advocacy websites or consumer protection websites. There were some homeowner websites that were what I call gripe sites,
Yeah.
you know, where the homeowner goes out there to kind of get back at the HOA to complain about them. And they hope, you know, that by sharing that information, that's going to make matters better, but it usually only escalates the problem. So that's how I started my blog. I started writing commentary and I did some commenting on some other blogs. And then from that, I started my own in 2014, 2015. And the rest is history. Now I have well over 1,000 posts, and you know, I've been covering not just, I didn't focus on just one state either. I look at the whole United States and overall trends because I'm kind of a big picture person. You know, I want people to see what exactly it is that they're buying into, understand the problems from the point of view of, you know, how state law affects what goes on in HOAs and how it doesn't help. In many cases, sometimes state laws make matters worse. So that's how I got into it. Does that answer your question?
Definitely.
Okay.
Thanks, Deb.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. Property owners, the best way to stand up for your rights is to become a member of USCFAR. Visit us at www.uscfar.com now.
And writing your blog for the last 9 or 10 years, like, what kind of impact have you seen from it? Like, has it obviously it connected us, but what other impact are you seeing that you're making?
I've noticed over the past 10 years, and I don't know if it's like I can take credit for it. There are other advocates out there that I've connected with over the past 10 years. There's an organization in California and Arizona, and you know, there's some people I know from the Virginia and Maryland area. Some of them are attorneys that help homeowners. Some of them are housing experts that are looking to help people who get in a situation with their HOA where maybe they're behind on dues or they've been fined unfairly, and now the HOA is going after them. So over the years, I've made a lot of contacts like that. I do notice that over the years, since I and some of these other advocates have been starting to call out the industry, particularly CAI, on their legislative views and frankly, their hypocrisy, there has been some movement of general public opinion away from favoring HOAs. When I started writing this blog, almost everything that you would see in the mainstream media about HOAs was always kind of pro HOA. It was almost as if the industry was writing little PR articles and then putting them in the real estate section of newspapers.
Having
Um,
been in the PR industry for 11
right.
years, I can tell you that's exactly what the PR
Yeah.
industry does.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. But the industry, things have changed over the last 10 years. There's a lot of other alternative media now. There's a
Mm.
lot of independent journalists. Um, People aren't reliant on newspapers that
Mainstream. Yeah.
much.
Right.
Even local TV stations are not they're not as dependent on advertising income from real estate developers as they used to be, quite frankly. So you're seeing more and more of the media pick up on some of these stories about what's going on in the HOA and condominium industry, like the one that I sent you the other day, Anne, about the
Yes.
$21 million
$1 million.
investment at Brickell. Is that how you say it? Brickell?
Brickell Avenue. Yes.
Brickell
Yeah.
Avenue condominium, which is a very high-end condominium association, and the buildings
Yes.
are only like 16 years old.
Yeah. That
And
surprised me when you sent that. Yeah.
already they're
That on
being
the
hit with
social.
this huge special assessment, where owners are going to be asked to come up with $40,000 per unit owner
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
to make
Yeah. Yeah.
repairs to a building that's only 16 years old.
Yeah.
So more and more of these stories are coming out.
Yeah.
When I
I
first,
yeah.
when I
I
first,
don't, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But to your point, I think that you're correct. When people buy into these communities, they come in and the amenities are nice and the homes are, homogeneous and it's, there's this lawn care and stuff, but they really don't know what's lurking underneath. And it's only until you get up against the board and, the people behind them that you realize you have very little rights as a property owner.
that's
Very
exactly right, Anne.
little
That's
and
exactly
property
right.
rights. You've basically left the continental United States, buy into one of these communities. And we want to thank you because you've been at this fight for 10 years.
Mhm.
And that's amazing. I mean, we're just starting to get into it because of my experience. But I had no idea when I bought into my community what I was going to be faced with.
Yeah. I mean, you think when you're going into one of these communities that everybody's going to be friendly and they're all on the same page about wanting to keep things well maintained. What I often see in many of these communities is that the nature of the covenants and restrictions almost pits neighbor against neighbor because there's this sort of tattletale mentality that develops among what we call Karens,
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
that want to pick on certain neighbors because they don't like the flower pot that you put on your front porch, or, they don't like your holiday decoration or whatever.
There is a hierarchy that's established, and to what Deborah was saying before about different interests. Now, I'm in a 55 plus community, so we have people that have come in that are 55 and still working. We have people on the older range who are on fixed incomes, and so it's not a homogeneous group.
Right.
We all have different interests, we all have different pocketbooks. And so when it comes time to maintaining, repairing, improving, everyone pulls in opposite directions. So it's not as if you own your own home and you can do your own repairs. You're working with other people. And that always leaves some people out of the decision making or feel that their choice wasn't picked. So it does create animosity between neighbors. You're absolutely right. And
Mhm.
if you're marginalized, if you're, one of the few who wants certain things done or followed, you become marginalized and then you're on the out. So it's not a pleasant environment, for most people.
Yeah, I would agree.
When I was in litigation with my board, I went looking for help. I had gone through to the state, I had contacted all the governmental agencies. Nobody could help me. They all said,
Right.
no, no, no. Okay. So I found CAI online, And I called their Washington office and said, because they had an office in Florida, but I wanted to know who they were. And I asked them who they represented in associations. I said, do you represent the boards? Do you represent the property owners, the membership? Who do you represent? And they said, we represent everybody, which didn't make any sense to me.
Right.
But they put me through to the local chapter, and I spoke to them and asked them the same question. I said, who do you represent? Well, we represent everybody. So after a few minutes, I realized they weren't going to help me, but they invited me to a luncheon. And I went to a luncheon that was sponsored by a law firm that ironically was actually the law firm that was the law firm that represented my community for a couple of years. They sponsored the luncheon. There were roofers there. There were management companies there. There were other contractors who were looking for business from board members, because that's who they invited were board members. So they didn't address any of my issues as a property owner. They were really looking to create to make business connections within the association
They were
industry.
generating leads.
That's right. That's what they were doing. So that was my experience with them personally.
Yeah, it was kind of my experience too when I went when I was on these forums. You would have community association managers out there complaining about, oh, those homeowners are so difficult.
Yes.
They don't understand. And sometimes you'd have an attorney come out and say, oh, well, they just don't have enough education, and they didn't read their documents. And then they'd have a few trolls come on there, and they would troll people like me. And there was one other person at the time that would ask them, pointed questions, and we would get trolled like, well, didn't you read your documents before you bought your house in your association? And I said, well, I did read them, but I didn't know that they meant what exactly they meant because of the language that's in the documents. I read into it a different meaning. For example, I read about how there are elections of board members and people get to vote, but I didn't realize until after I moved into my association that our association was divided into voting districts, and each district had what they call the voting member, and only that member got to vote for who was on the board.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we had 25 voting districts, voting members at the time, to represent an association with more than 1,000 homes. And my comment was, I came from a small township in Pennsylvania, population 1,200, and we had a board of supervisors that we would elect, and all 1,200 of us who lived in the community had a legal right to vote. So we had a real democratic election. I said, here we don't have that. We've got basically 25 friends of the board electing the board. That's how it worked. And when I started to look into other governing documents and bylaws of other associations, especially the larger communities, I realized this was very common to have either, to have like these sub-associations and then what they call a master association over all the sub-associations.
Yes. Yeah.
And how your master association board was comprised, it was whoever was the president of your sub-association. So you might elect the person in your sub-association, and even that's questionable, how that was handled. But you really only had voting clout to vote for one person on the master association board out of,
and
9 or
they
12.
could vote in any way they wanted on any issue.
Right. It's not like you could have a directed proxy, or that you could go in and tell your board member how you want them to vote. They didn't even ask you how you wanted them to vote. They just basically got in the boardroom and had their meetings and decided on the budget, and the assessment and the insurance coverage, and there really wasn't any open discussion.
Yeah, there's really no democratic representation in a lot of these associations. That's the problem. And to that point, I wanted to read an email that Mark and I got from someone in Oregon about CAI and an election. And I'm not going to mention his name because he didn't give us permission, but he writes, I do not know of any organizations in Oregon that are interested in securing rights for HOA members living in Oregon. The Community Associations Institute, CAI, is very active in our state. A lawyer that belongs to CAI and a property manager that also belongs to CAI together recently abrogated Oregon statutory laws and installed a pre-selected board of directors in a fraudulent election with the participation of 70% of the association members. This board will continue to consist of pre-selected candidates far into the future. The problem is that there are no practical remedies for homeowners who have had their rights denied. And this comes from the state of Oregon, so it's happening all over the country.
That's correct. What a lot of people don't understand either about HOA and condo elections is that in a regular election, you get one vote, and it's based on your place of residency. Okay.
Ownership.
But when you go to an HOA or condo, it's all about ownership of property. So if you live in a condo tower, but you don't own it, you don't get any vote. If you own, let's say there's a building that has 20 units in it. If you own 5 of those units, you get 5 votes. You get the votes for those 5 units.
Yes.
And maybe you don't even live there. Maybe you're living in another state as an investor or another country for that matter. And you own 5 units, you get 5 votes. So it's a completely different method of voting. And that's why it's kind of my pet peeve when Community Associations Institute says, well, if you don't like what's going on in your board, get involved and just elect a new board. But in reality, in certain communities, that's not really feasible, as this owner from Oregon just explained in the email that you read. I've seen cases where in a small townhouse or condominium association where you will have investors that own, a majority of the units. So they own enough voting interest to basically vote themselves onto the board every year. And if they want to amend the governing documents, often they have enough votes, or they only have to get a few extra votes to amend the governing documents to their advantage. And that's what they do. In some cases, they'll even initiate a termination of the condominium association if they want to buy out the remaining owners so that they can turn around and make it a rental property or tear it down and start all over and build something else that's going to give them a bigger return on investment. Now, that's not happening everywhere, but it is something that if you're going to buy a condominium or a townhouse, you have to be very aware of who are the other owners in the community. And a lot of times you can find that out by checking the assessor's records at the county level. And if you see a lot of LLCs and trusts or, the same names coming up over and over again on the units, that's kind of a red flag that a few people in the community might be running the association.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. The Association Nightmares podcast is brought to you by U.S. Coalition for Association Reform. USCFAR is committed to changing how associations are governed by shifting the balance of power to better safeguard and advance the rights of individual property owners. The best way to stand up for your property rights is to become a member of USCFAR. Visit us at www.uscfar.com now.
That's very interesting because that brings up the fact that a lot of people feel when they go into a common interest community that there's a certain amount of safety in there, okay, which is not true. because I think in one of your blogs, actually, I read that there was a board that was sued for defamation or discrimination, and they lost. And I think the community was assessed, I think, $5 million by the courts, if I remember correctly. And so the membership of that association had to fork up $5 million because their board lost the lawsuit. And just talking about the fact that people can manipulate the governing documents and can, close out close out an association. We really are putting our money at risk. That's really what we're doing. And people are not aware of it, especially now it's happening in Florida with the the SB4D bill, with all
Right.
these assessments. You are not safe. You're really, it's entering a whole different dimension.
Yeah, because you don't have control over your money. You don't
Yes.
have direct control over what's going to happen to your property. It's not as though you're moving into a building or a community with other people that have been pre-screened and that you have something in common with.
Mhm.
People don't understand. This isn't an Amish community or the Quakers. You know what I mean? It's
I was
not
thinking Mennonite when you started that.
right.
Mhm.
It's not even what they call an intentional communities, which are big over in Scandinavia, where, a small group of owners people get together and they decide they want to build a place and they share these values and they're willing to all work with one another. There's not going to be a board versus
Right.
the rest of us
Mhm.
structure. They all build a consensus and they have a genuine care for one another.
Yes.
That's not what this is. What you're buying into is kind of a corporate, small government bureaucracy. And it's all about the politics and people who don't want to get involved in politics. Well, if you don't get involved in politics in your HOA or condominium association, hold on to your wallet and watch
Yeah.
out for your bank account, because whoever gets in control of that board and of the money and the purse strings, they're going to be the ones making the decisions about how much money to spend. Just because a roof needs to be replaced or windows need to be replaced, that doesn't mean that you need to upgrade them considerably at a cost of 25 or 30% more, and then assess everybody that higher
Correct.
cost. Because I see that happening all the time. The other extreme is that sometimes you have people who are on the board that don't want to spend any money at all. So they just let maintenance go and they do the bare minimum and try to milk the association as long as they can, hoping to drive out people, who are owners. And then as they do that, they'll buy up units. And pretty soon you have a whole condo association that's all rental units.
Mhm.
You'll see that especially on some of the less affluent, what they call more affordable housing areas. And people don't realize, if you're retiring and you're on a fixed income and they think, oh, I'm going to buy this condo and it only costs me this much a month and my fees cover all the maintenance and I don't have to worry about it and I can lock and go. Well, in in 5 or 10 years, your fees could double or triple.
Oh, yeah. I
Yes.
just saw a headline the other day about an HOA with 1,000% increase
Right.
year over year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So can you imagine you're paying 150 a month and it goes to 1,500 a month like this?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And most people
Well,
can't absorb that. I mean, let's face it,
No,
most people
no.
can't. And
Yeah.
unless you're in the top, 10% of wage or income earners, or if you have a high net worth, you probably can't absorb that.
Correct.
You were talking before about the fact that when you were living in Florida, you had requested documents, and I have neighbors And that's a right of a property owner. You know, as a shareholder in the corporation, we do have the right by Florida law to request documents because people want more transparency. They want to know what the boards are doing. How are they spending my money? And so that brings us to the what I just picked up recently was the Corporate Transparency Act. And could you kind of tell us what CAI is doing in relation to that?
We'll do that. So I'll first briefly explain what the Corporate Transparency Act is. In 2020, there was a law that was passed, the Anti-Money Laundering Act.
AML. That's what it goes.
Right.
Mhm.
So the purpose of that act is to prevent money laundering and potential funding of terrorist activities in the US.
And that's on the federal level. That's
Right.
a federal law.
Because what was happening, because I remember following the news in the real estate industry for like, the last 8-10 years. And there was a lot of activity with people either in the US or foreign nationals buying properties in the US, luxury properties, and putting it in the name of an LLC or a shell corporation. You don't really know who owns it.
Right.
And we don't know where that money is coming from. And when investigators try to investigate because of this situation of LLCs and shell corporations owning property and assets, there's no way to really track the money. It's very difficult to do that. So this legislation at the federal level was meant to address that. So they came up with this
Transparency.
They came up with this Corporate Transparency Act in order to make sure that all of these corporations that were being started would have a list of the beneficial owners of the corporation with real names, addresses, identification. So basically, there's a requirement that if you have a corporation and you are in substantial control over it, and in the case of an HOA, that would be board members, it might even be management agents, you would have to file with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, this registration that includes your name, your address, your date of birth, and some kind of identifying documentation. It could be a driver's license, a non-driver's license issued by your state, or a passport.
Mhm.
And that's it. That's the only requirement. The reason for that is so that if there were any kind of information or suspicion about money laundering or inappropriate use of finances being done in the US, investigators would be able to trace back who the owners of this corporation are. They wouldn't be able to hide all this money in these little corporations. And in fact, they're so serious about this at FinCEN that if you don't file this information and keep it updated on their database, there are substantial fines and potential jail time for not doing so. Here's where CAI comes in.
Yeah.
CAI says that, oh, this isn't necessary for homeowners associations because, it's just a group of volunteer homeowners who have the interests of their neighbors at heart. And, there's no evidence that there's anything nefarious going on in these associations. And if you make board members have to file this personal information in this database, then they're all going to resign. They're all going to resign.
Yes.
And in fact,
they're going to run.
Right. They're going to run. And then, the whole industry is going to fall apart. So CAI tried to, over the last year or so, they tried to talk with the people at FinCEN and the Treasury Department to get community associations exempt from having to file this information. And they weren't buying it. In fact, they went out and posted some information out on their FAQ page that clarifies that, yes, homeowners associations are still required to comply with CTA. So in September, CAI decided to file a lawsuit against FinCEN, the U.S. Treasury Department, and Janet Yellen. They got together with a couple of their member homeowner associations and came up with this lawsuit that basically said all of the things that I just explained to you. I mean, they even went so far as to say that their First and Fourth Amendment rights are being trampled on because you're forcing them to speak by providing this information. And you're, if they have to resign because they're afraid that they'll be fined if they don't file it timely, then you're violating their rights to free assembly. And I mean, it was just so.
Yeah, it's out there.
So out there. And of course, at the same time that they filed the lawsuit, they filed what's known as a preliminary injunction, which in legal circles just means that while the case is ongoing, they're asking the court to let them be exempt from filing these things because we're going to win in the end anyway. A court won't issue a preliminary injunction unless you provide them evidence that you have a strong case. And in this case, they don't. So the preliminary injunction was summarily denied. But the case is still ongoing.
Right. They appealed it. They appealed the decision.
They appealed it. But that's what's going on.
And when you consider all of the headlines that we've seen about board members absconding with millions of dollars, it makes a lot of sense that there would be more transparency. Well,
I mean, real estate is one of the places where people who are under money laundering, that's one of the primary places where they'll hide money.
Yeah, because you can have a very quick pop in value. You think about the art market, people selling paintings that have no value for $1 million. So it's just another area, but it does make sense as well in real estate.
Right. And it's not as though this database from FinCEN is a public database. It's not. Yeah. It's a private database that only FinCEN will have access to. Frankly, I think that it would be more transparent if the industry, not only to the homeowners in their community, but at large, would provide information about who's on the board, and committees, and make it public.
We're talking about following money at the federal level, but when we look at CAI as an organization, they're taking membership dues from HOA boards.
Right.
You had mentioned in an email to us the percentage of boards represented. We can get into that in a second, but they're not just using these monies for the purposes of keeping their organization together and further educating the members who are on the trade side. It seems that they're using quite a bit of that money for lobbying and advocacy, and a lot of that isn't necessarily in the best interests of homeowners. Like this example, it's not in the best interest of homeowners.
That's right.
For us to not have board members tracked by the Treasury Department and FinCEN. In the securities industry and in banking, you've got FinCEN oversight, so that if somebody has connections to a known financier of nefarious types of dealings, they can flag that person, look at what's going on. And there have been a lot of legal cases, criminal cases, where board members have been arrested. There's quite a few recently here in Florida.
Exactly.
So can we talk a little bit about how CAI is using their membership dues and using their clout for lobbying and advocacy that is against homeowner interests?
Yes, I'll give you a little bit of information. So there was a podcast that I listened to not long ago where Dawn Bauman from CAI, she's the Senior VP of Government and Public Affairs. She claimed in this podcast that about 40% of CAI members are homeowner leaders. About 30 to 35% are community association managers and management companies, and the remaining are a mixture of other professionals. So using that information, I went out and looked at CAI's Board of Trustees. CAI is managed by a Board of Trustees with 15 members. And of those members, 8 of them are community association managers. 5 are business partners or, people who profit from the industry. And only 2 are homeowner leaders. So you can already see a mismatch between the percentage of representation on their Board of Trustees and how many people are their members.
Mm-hmm.
The Board of Trustees then they're advised by 3 councils. There's a Community Association Managers Council, they have 12 members, a Business Partners Council with 12 members, and a Homeowner Leaders Council that only has 6 members. So again, you're seeing there's a mismatch between the homeowners that they claim to represent.
It's inverted. It's completely inverted.
Completely inverted. And CAI estimates there's more than 365,000 community associations in the United States. So that's, like 70, 80 million people. There's a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do the math, take 40% of 40, they have 47,000 members in CAI. 40% of 40,000 members is 18,800 members. And if you assume that the average HOA board size is 5 members, some are more, some are less, that's probably average. I estimate there's maybe 3,700 community associations represented in the US out of like 365,000. So it's less than 1%.
Yeah, and even
So
if the estimate is off by 10 times,
right.
Still the vast minority of homeowners associations.
Exactly.
So
Right.
then CAI is really misrepresenting the fact that they speak for the homeowners.
Absolutely.
It's blatant. It's totally blatant.
Yeah.
So where do they get this nerve to go to sue the federal government on behalf of the homeowners? I mean, I want more transparency, not less.
Exactly.
And if our board members wanted to open a bank account, that's the information that they would be required to submit to open a bank account.
Or to file your taxes.
Yeah. So they're not being asked to do anything that really exposes them unless there's something that they're hiding.
One would wonder, right? One has to wonder.
So what do you think CAI's motivation is behind, trying to not allow this to go forth or to fight this transparency?
Well,
what do you think it really is?
I think that CAI has a pattern of they really want to have boards in full control of the money that's collected for each association. So if you look at their public policies, you'll see that CAI wants board members to have the unhindered right to set the budget, set the assessments, issue special assessments, make all the decisions about who they hire to do the work without any input or vote of membership whatsoever.
And if you think about like taxes, we just voted in our area about adding a half a penny additional taxes for
exactly.
For school boards. So it takes away that fundamental right.
Right. You don't have any. They don't want you to have any right, and the rationale that they use for it is, oh, well, the homeowners don't know any better, and the board they're also members, so, they're doing this in your best interest. And if you don't force the homeowners to,
Comply.
allow the board to do all this control, then everything will just go to hell in a handbasket,
Yes.
And there's a little bit of truth to the fact that a lot of people don't want to put money into a building, and they will put things off and kick the can down the road. I get that. But that's a completely different way of looking at things than saying, all right, let's all get together transparently as homeowners and talk about, here's the financial problems that we're facing. Let's have a discussion. Let's have a town hall. If it's a small group, let's all get together over coffee or dinner and talk about, here's the challenges that we're facing. And this is what we need to consider. And here's the things that we have to do to meet building code. And here's some other things that we'd like to do that, maybe we have to put off. I think homeowners should have the right to be an active participant in that.
Yeah. I'm here.
I agree with that very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah,
But
it's a
CAI
more
doesn't,
participatory model, and technology really enables that today. You don't even necessarily need to put something on the schedule and have everybody show up in one place.
exactly.
You could have a simple app that would say, hey, this is the issue we're voting on. Watch the 1-minute video pro and the 1-minute video con, and cast your vote. You've got you've got until next week to do that, and they can get the vote of everybody.
And that could work depending on who's making the video and how they're spinning the issue.
Of course,
That's true.
Because I've seen a lot of issues. I had the same experience with my association where they would have this newsletter that would go out, and they would spin the issue that we were having with the stormwater pond in a way that make them look good, but didn't tell the whole truth. And, so, I think there needs to be more interaction. And it's true that a lot of homeowners aren't really paying attention, and they're not getting as involved as they should be.
But they pay attention when they get hit by special assessment.
Right.
They pay
Yes.
attention when the fees go up. So they are starting to pay attention more and more, because this is eating into their budget.
Right.
It's hitting them in their pockets. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting because this country was built on private property. I mean, we had talked at one point that we come from, families of immigrants.
Right.
And this is the way immigrants built wealth, by buying homes. And this model really works against that. So, buying into an association and fighting this behemoth structure really works against our best interests.
Right. Yeah,
When
I
we
would
talk
agree
about-
with you. I would agree with you, Ann.
And when we talk about the behemoth, I'm listening to what you're saying, Deborah. I'm like, I just wonder how much money is being collected in HOA fees. So I just Googled that. The most recent statistic comes out in 2021. It said $106 billion in fees and assessments. So
money.
the industry
Big
is
money.
in a lot of money. And that was 2021. As we know, HOA fees and dues and assessments have gone up quite a bit in those years. So maybe it's at $250 billion or 200 billion at this point. So that data comes out, but that is a heavy stream of money that that somebody that would be looking to skim off would be very happy to dive into.
And of course, if you can have an association where you can have co-memberships with your leads, built-in sales leads, that's all the better for you as an organization, right?
Yeah.
And that what they also don't tell you is that some of these homeowner leaders are realtors, investors. Some of them go on to get their community association manager license.
Yeah.
That part they keep kind of quiet.
Mm-hmm. It's like the surveys they take, correct? CIA takes surveys.
Oh yeah. Well,
Tell us about that.
When you sign up for a membership at CAI, I think the I looked up the fee for an association. If you want to sign up 2 to 15 board members from your HOA, it's $260 a year. In that $260 a year, there's a mandatory $45 advocacy fee for CAI. That pays for their legislative action committees.
Mm.
So that they could lobby for bills like this federal bill that they've been lobbying for to exempt community associations from the Corporate Transparency Act. But in addition to that, they request a voluntary donation of $15 to their Foundation for Community Association Research. And then they use that money to hire Zogby to come up with this every other year, to come up with this HOA satisfaction survey and other smaller surveys that they do on different hot button issues. Now, I don't imagine that there's too many homeowner members that are adding a $15 donation. But certainly the industry members could be funding this $15 donation. So they're basically paying for a survey to make them appear as if their industry is pretty good.
Yeah.
Very well liked.
Because there's plenty of other surveys by other organizations, and we can do that in another podcast, that show people aren't really that happy with HOAs.
Yeah, we've heard numbers from 57% dissatisfaction and up to like 80 or 90% people are unhappy in common interest communities.
Exactly. Whereas, CAI claims, 85% of people just they like their HOA and, their preferred places to live. That's one of their taglines. And, everything is great. But if you look at the questions that they ask and the way that they ask them, and even the people that answer the survey, it's an online survey, so it's people who opt into participating. So you can't even say that they have a representative sample. Anybody who's ever done a survey understands that a survey is only as good as the sample of the people that you surveyed, and the quality of the questions that you ask them. If you're asking leading questions and loaded questions, or you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to come up with an honest assessment of your product or service. What you're going to come up with is you're going to kind of steer people to answer a certain way.
Yeah, you can kind of tweak things.
You can
in your direction, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's who you sample as well,
Right.
Yeah.
So, and who would participate in a survey like that? So there's lots of ways, as that old phrase goes, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there's statistics.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So as I think about this as well, I think there's a lot of implications for the homeowners, but to put a little finer point on what we're talking about a moment ago is that, it's not like homeowners have that many options these days,
right?
Especially in newly developed communities. Developed, in the past, say 20 to 30 years, most all of them are in HOAs. So, so it's not like we've got a choice. 50% of new housing starts are in non-HOA communities versus the other half that are in. So if 80% of what's on the market is in an HOA, or even more in some places, it's kind of giving us there's no option really to go outside of it.
Right.
So really intractable. What could you add anything to that? Or
well, there's actually some statistics on that from the Survey of Construction through the U.S. Census. And I don't have the exact figures sitting in front of me now, but I'll ballpark them for you. We're up to like close to 80% of new builds. This is only looking at new construction and only going back about 25 years. But we're up to like 75 to 80% of new homes nationwide and we're not looking at condominiums, we're just looking at single-family homes,
Yeah.
are in an HOA.
Yeah.
However, when you divide the country into different regions, the Northeast and the Midwest have considerably lower percentage of new builds in HOAs than the South and the West. In the South and the West, it approaches, high 80s,
Yeah.
percent.
And
If
that
you look
also seems
at,
to be where most of the migration of people has gone.
right, in the Northeast where I live, it's more like 57, 43%, something like that. So there's still options if you move to the Northeast and things like that, where you might find more non-HOA options for new construction. And I think that's mostly because there, you can still buy land, there's still some infill opportunities, but on a local level, what I notice even where I live, there's a lot of townhouse communities going up, and they almost always have an HOA, even though townhouses don't have to have an HOA. But a lot of the new builders, they build them as with an HOA, with common maintenance of the exterior and all of that.
Yeah.
But you can still buy, there are still some developments in northeastern Pennsylvania and some in central Pennsylvania where you can buy a new home on a lot of land and there's no HOA. But you're going to pay at the very top of the price range for that, and most buyers can't afford it.
And you would have more property taxes, and if you're
Right.
in a state like in the Northeast, you tend to have other taxation that you don't have, like here in Florida. Have very no personal income tax from the state.
So we have a pretty robust resale market for
Yeah.
that reason. And most of the resales are not in HOAs in my part of the state. But if you go out to areas surrounding Philadelphia area, you're going to find that much of the construction in the last 20 years is either a townhouse or it's in a planned community that has an HOA. So it becomes hard, like if you want to live in a particular school district or within a certain commuting distance to where you work, near an airport, all of these other factors, it can be very difficult to avoid.
Yeah.
And in some places that are very, where you have a lot of urban density, I mean, most people can't afford a detached home, so they're automatically looking at a condo.
Yeah.
Or renting. That's really their only two options.
Yeah, and even as a renter, I when I first was divorced, I rented a coach home in an HOA community, and the HOA most certainly governed me and my activities when I was inside of that community. It was they threatened the homeowner with crazy fines for small things.
Right.
For example, my companion dog, they said, oh, if you don't have the form that it's a emotional support animal, we're going to fine you $1,000 if you don't get rid of the dog. So landlord says, I need that piece of paper, $40 later online to get the piece of paper. But it's just crazy fees. $1,000 to do something like that. Just
and did you know on that line, of thinking, let's say that you didn't get the piece of paper and your landlord got fined $1,000 a day and didn't pay it because he was disputing it. Did you know that in most states, and CAI advocates for this, your HOA can turn around and get an order to collect the rent directly from you and bypass your landlord?
I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Look it up. It applies in Florida and a lot of other states.
Yeah.
So that goes back to private property rights. I mean,
yes,
here they're going they're going to take away your right to collect money from your tenant because you owe them money, even if that money is in dispute.
Wow. Yeah. So
So,
almost like civil asset forfeiture.
mhm. Yeah.
There's been no judgment yet, but they take it in.
Mhm. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. And I fortunately no longer live there. But just to touch on something that we talked about earlier, I've had some communications with the community manager at in the HOA I'm now living in. And I think she let her guard down a little bit, and she was talking about how she felt about some of the homeowners.
Mhm.
And and this goes to what we were talking about earlier. There is this kind of distaste of, oh, those rude homeowners. She was
Right.
in
Yeah.
a way bragging to me about how, the power she held. Well,
Mhm.
people who are nice to me, I take care of. You're going to need something from me like architectural approval. So if people are nice to me, I make it go easy. But if people aren't, well, it goes to the bottom of the pile.
Right. Right.
Welcome to the gulag.
Yes.
I mean, that is very much like you would expect in a gulag
Yeah.
type of system.
It's all bureaucracy. That's
Mhm.
what we're living in, a dystopian bureaucracy.
And not just the managers behave that way, but some of your board members can do the same
Yeah.
Yes.
thing. Because
Yeah.
Yeah.
there's a lot of times when you'll get somebody who's on the board and they're kind of vindictive against a particular person for whatever
Yes.
reason. And
Yes.
all of a sudden they'll be getting all these violation notices, they'll be hassled about, it's time to paint
Minutia.
their house, anything.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's because the industry has pushed over the years to give HOA boards just too much power over their neighbors. The
Correct.
power to fine them without having to take the case before a
No
magistrate or
due
judge.
process. No due process on
No
power.
due process, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. The power to, raise assessments as high as they want. And, the thing that's even more frustrating is that sometimes they're raising the assessments and you're not even seeing a return. Like in my
Yeah.
case, we're paying $100 a month and you're not maintaining what you're supposed to be maintaining.
Yeah. Well,
But
that goes back to transparency again.
right, as a renter, if your landlord isn't fixing your heater and you try to get them to do it and they don't do it, you can call in a heating guy, have it fixed, and then deduct it from your rent. And if the landlord challenges it, you can take it to court and they'll find in your favor. Okay. But you don't have that option if you live in a HOA or a condo.
Yeah.
You have to pay your fees on time, in full, no matter what, even if the HOA doesn't do diddly squat.
A threat of lien on your property, potential
Right.
foreclosure.
Foreclosure. Yeah.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
think that, one of the things that legislators need to be looking at is reining in some of that power of HOAs to do these sort of things. Maybe they shouldn't have that kind of power.
Yeah.
Uh,
I do think that,
I agree with you on that. Totally.
and I think that CAI does a great job of showing the legislature or the legislators that they represent homeowners. We've heard, I can't recall who shared the story with us right now. Maybe it was you, Deborah, but where CAI would bus in like 50 people who represented.
It was Jan. It was Jan who told
Okay.
us that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where they would bus into Tallahassee, the capital of Florida,
right.
to show a force. And this is why we developed USCFAR, because the homeowners, property owners, condo owners, we're not really represented anywhere.
Right.
So how do you get the attention of legislatures? Right. And you get that by having a lot of people make noise or say, hey, I represent tens of thousands of people, and this is how we feel about this issue. So we want you to listen to us. But it's also letter writing campaigns,
Right.
campaigns,
Emails.
phone
Yeah.
calls. And by doing those things, we really, as property owners, we need to raise our voices.
Right. We need to have a coalition of activists to a certain extent, where people will be willing to invest a little bit of their time to have their voice heard. And it's a little bit challenging to get that done. But I think that over the past couple of years, with all the rising costs and and the obvious abuses, that there's more awareness of these issues now. And I think that the time is ripe for people to get on board and say, hey, it's time to protect my rights as a property owner, and to prevent abuses of power and lack of transparency and all of these issues, because that's the only way that we're going to see an improvement, is if there's an actual intentional move toward change.
Well said. OCAI has fought against transparency. So as a homeowner, as a condo owner, co-op owner, property owner, can you really trust them? My take on it is no, we can't. And that's why we need to come together and we need to stand up for our own rights. And so, Deborah, thank you so much for all the work that you do on behalf of property owners. It's really a very commendable and admirable. You're a wonderful resource for us to learn about what's going on. And some people are willing to take the time to learn what's going on, and other people just know that it doesn't feel right to have your voice taken away, to have more money taken out of your bank that you can't control at threat of foreclosure or at threat of selective enforcement. So we really appreciate the work that you've done and for joining us.
I think Deborah should give everyone the name of her blog so that they can actually sign up for it, because it's wonderful.
Yeah. How do people find it, Deborah?
So the name of my blog is independentamericans.com. Independentamericans.com. Interestingly, the acronym for that is IAC, which is the opposite of CAI.
Was that intentional?
Not really. No, it was pointed out to me actually by a reader about a year or two after I started the blog. And I said, I didn't really think about it, but that's an interesting observation. But
it really is. And I want to thank you for the work that you do, because it was great. I met you through your blog and it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to know both of you, and I hope we can work together and continue with some podcasts in the future. Thank you for having me.
We'll do this again. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. Thank you.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. There's no better way to show your annoyance with a rogue board than to show up at your next association meeting wearing a t-shirt from ftheboard.com. F the Board has great-looking limited edition t-shirts, hats, and mugs that spur conversation and let you express exactly how you feel while supporting the property rights revolution. Visit ftheboard.com today.
So that was a great conversation with Deborah. I'm really glad that she joined us. To get her blog, you're going to go to independentamericans.com. You could sign up for her blog there. She writes a lot of great articles. And also, as you heard in our podcast, there is something that you can do as a property owner. We need a coalition, and that's what we've created at USCFAR, uscfar.com, the U.S. Coalition for Association Reform. We are working only on the behalf of the property owners so that we can raise your voice and provide a counterbalance to this very entrenched large organization that's working against our property rights. So we highly encourage you to go to our website and join us. There are still founding memberships available, and also great merchandise, t-shirts, hats, and mugs, so that you can go into your board meetings and share exactly how you feel.
If you like these podcasts, please support us.
Yeah, and what you can do, you can join USCFAR. You could subscribe to this podcast. You can like it. You can set your alerts so that you'll get the next one. We are producing a bunch of these in a block, and we're going to be releasing them on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So you'll get to see the next one. We've got some great guests lined up. So go ahead, follow us on social media as well. We'll have all the links in the description. Thanks so much for joining us, and stand up. There is power in numbers.
Thanks for joining the Association Nightmare Podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you again soon.